Hi, welcome back to educator.com. This is the next nervous system lesson, specifically on the spinal cord and nerves. If we were to look at the nervous system as a giant flow chart that had to do with the brain, the spinal cord, and all the nerves, this is a very good representation. So up at the top here in the orange box, we have the central nervous system, which, as you learned before if you saw the previous lesson, is the brain and spinal cord. That communicates with the peripheral nervous system, which is all the nerves extending from the spine and extending from the cerebral area, from the cranium. These work in conjunction, of course, having to do with sending out signals, getting signals up into them. And there are two main divisions in terms of the tracks that the neurons run along. There's the motor or efferent division and the sensory or afferent division. Sensory has to do with your senses. Those are the signals going from the peripheral nervous system up into the spinal cord and brain. It's the opposite with motor. Motor having to do with movement, having to do with initiating those responses from out of the central nervous system. The way that I keep the words afferent and efferent straight is I think of it alphabetically in terms of the brain being up top, kind of like the top of the alphabet. And so A has to do with going up to the brain. Afferent is all of these sensory signals. Efferent is going down, going out. And another way you could remember it is that the end goal of an efferent signal is the effector, which starts with the same beginning there. Whatever's being effected, a muscle, a gland, an organ, by that motor signal. And so yeah, motor nerve fibers and sensory nerve fibers, sometimes they're contained in different nerves, and other times there are nerves that are called mixed because they have both afferent and efferent tracks. When you look at the spinal cord as a whole, the spinal cord has a motor section or afferent section. Efferent, I just did it. Motor or efferent section and sensory or afferent section. So make sure you keep those straight. Afferent, efferent. Then when you look at how the motor part of it is working in terms of initiating actions in your body, the somatic portion is all the things you have conscious control over. Soma means body. So when I move my fingers, move my arm, move my legs, those have to do with the somatic or voluntary motor neurons because I've elected to consciously do that. But the other side of it is autonomic. Autonomic, think of it as automatic. It's a slightly different word, but it basically means the same thing. It's automatic without you having to think about it. So the autonomic part of the motor division is all of those activities that just happen without you having to think about it. For instance, your heart rate. You do not have to think about beating your heart, and that's a good thing. Your breath rate. Yes, you can consciously choose to manipulate your breathing, but you don't have to. And then of course there's the blood vessels. Another one is sweating. Sweating, you don't have to think to make yourself sweat. It happens when you need it to. Same with digestion. So all of those things are regulated by the autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system. Specifically, it's the motor branch of the PNS. When you look at the autonomic part, there's two main divisions, which I'm going to go over in more detail later in this lesson. The sympathetic, which has to do with fight or flight response when there's danger, and then the opposite of it, which is parasympathetic, which is more like rest and digest. So all of these fit together to make your nervous system do what it does. The spinal cord, this particular part of the central nervous system, is how the brain is connected to the body, and how the body is connected to the brain. When we look at the white versus gray matter, it's actually flipped compared to the brain. Remember, in the brain, gray matter is superficial, white matter is deep. It's the opposite here. This is one of those horizontal or transverse cross sections, and you can see that along the superficial portion of it, it's very white, and the deepest part is gray. So once you go through the medulla oblongata, it flips. And it actually makes sense that a large proportion of the spinal cord is white matter. Because if you remember from previous lessons, white matter is because of having a lot of those myelinated axons, those Schwann cells or oligodendrocytes in certain parts, give it that white appearance. So it's the signaling part. And spinal cord is very much a signaler. The central canal is the deepest part, the most central part, so it's a perfect name, central canal. It is a tiny hollow tube down the spinal cord where you're going to have cerebrospinal fluid. And there also is cerebrospinal fluid along the outside of the spinal cord. The spinal cord itself travels through the foramen magnum of each vertebra, and so together the foramina of the vertebrae contain the spinal cord. When you get down to the lumbar region, those little holes, the foramina, are proportionally smaller, and the spinal cord eventually branches outside of that, and it almost looks like a horse's tail down at the bottom of your back if you were to look at all the extensions of the spinal cord coming out. And because of that, they call it the cauda equina, which in Latin means horsetail. So the spinal cord itself kind of branches out significantly to the point where it doesn't look like a compacted cord anymore when you get past the mid-back. When we look in more detail at what's going on inside the spinal cord, you have a motor side and a sensory side. You can call them motor tracts and sensory tracts. The motor, or going out from the central nervous system, the commanding of muscles and other tissues, that is on the more anterior side. So motor, we're going to use red. And that's why there's this little ventral root here. I'm going to mention that again in a sec. That has to do with the sending out of those motor signals. So that's on the anterior or ventral side of the spinal cord. And the sensory, also known as the afferent part, the coming in of signals into the spinal cord, is on the posterior or dorsal side, the back side. Remember efferent and afferent. So afferent is definitely the sensory part going up towards the brain, and efferent is going out. So I'm going to also color coordinate this. Efferent is the motor side of it. Afferent is the sensory side. When we look at the sequence of how the signal goes through, remember motor is going out. Sensory is coming in, and there's also nerves that have both. So when you look at what this afferent sequence is doing, this is actually coming from some sensory nerve that's taking information to the central nervous system. This one is the efferent side that's actually commanding some tissue to do something, and together in this case, it looks like they actually come together in one nerve. In other cases, you're not going to see that. So the reason why I have this here is you sometimes do have nerves that have both tracks in them, and there are other nerves that are one or the other. When we look at what's going on inside of these tracks, motor intersensory basically means if you have a signal coming into the body, by coming into the body, I mean something, let's say, touches your skin, and then you want to have the sensation of that come to the spinal cord and the brain so you can react to it. The sensory part is definitely the coming in, right? Then you have something called interneurons, which will connect the sensory and motor parts together. It's kind of like the go-between, the middleman. So the interneuron, you're going to find that a lot in the spinal cord. It's what connects the sensory to the motor. So your ability to react to some kind of stimulus, some kind of sensation, has to do with the sensory communicating with an interneuron that then commands certain motor neurons via neurotransmitters to send out a signal to allow you to react to it. The dorsal root, ventral root comes back to this red and blue portion. The dorsal root is the back side, which would be blue. The ventral root is red. The spinal meninges, you're also going to have that layer of connective tissue sheathing, enveloping the spinal cord as you did with the brain in previous lessons. So along the outside of this, you're going to have those meningeal layers. The average adult spinal cord is about 45 centimeters long. That's the length. And the max in terms of width is 14 millimeters. So pretty thin. I think it's thinner than most people would think. It's going to be slightly wider on average up towards the top. As you go down the spinal cord, as you go posterior, you have a lot of nerve branches coming off. It's like a freeway where there's a lot of off-ramps coming off, taking cars off to their destinations. So by the time you get from the cervical part of the spinal cord down to the thoracic, on average in that region, it's going to be slightly less wide. But the area where it has the widest portion, only 14 millimeters. When we look at the different parts of that autonomic branch of the peripheral nervous system, remember there's the sympathetic or the parasympathetic. They're opposites. Right now I'm in more parasympathetic mode. The camera's not threatening and neither are you. So there's no reason why my heart rate needs to be really fast, my breath rate needs to be fast, and I need to have my skeletal muscles prepared to react. But in the case that something threatening does happen, you want your body to initiate a response. It's going to enable you to live longer and get rid of that threat. Either you are fleeing, that's the flight part, or you are fighting back. So when the sympathetic branch gets initiated, your heart rate, your blood pressure, and your breath rate are going to go up. Think about walking through a forest and seeing a bear or seeing some kind of, wild tiger. You want to be able to get away from that particular animal, if you can, to make yourself live longer. The pupils dilating, the amazing part of that is if something threatening happens, what's going to tend to happen is your pupils will expand. And the pupils are just the openings that let light into the eye. Why does that happen? The more light you let into your eyes, the more you can judge your surroundings to properly figure out what's going on and how to react to what you're seeing. Digestion's going to decrease. Here's why. It takes a lot of blood flow into the abdominal region to actually move digested food through and to absorb it. If I see a threatening thing in my environment that I need to react to, I'm going to put digestion on hold. I'm going to get that blood flow into my arms and legs primarily so I can book it or I can fight it. So digestion is going to tend to decrease. However, on a cellular level, especially when you look at muscle fibers, the metabolism, the breakdown and building up of ATP, and by breakdown I mean the breakdown of glucose and the building up of ATP as a result of that breakdown, is going to allow you to use your muscles a lot more in that instance. So though digestion decreases in terms of moving stuff through your digestive tract, on a cellular level, metabolism is going to go up. And of course, sweating is probably going to increase because the more muscular activity you're doing, the more heat you're going to generate, and you need to get rid of that heat via sweat. Parasympathetic, exact opposite. And there's another rhyme for it. Instead of fight or flight, it's rest and digest, which is a little rhyme. Your heart rate, blood pressure, and breath rate are going to drop. You're getting relaxed. There's nothing threatening. So why have your heart rate and blood pressure go through the roof? It's a waste of energy in that case. The opposite is going to happen with your pupils. They're going to constrict. Now, of course, if I'm resting in a room, just chilling, and the lights go down, my pupils are naturally going to open up a bit. But in general, your pupils tend to be more constricted when you don't need them to be dilated to assess something that's threatening. Digestion is going to increase. You're going to be able to digest a lot better when you're relaxed and chilling. A way that could kind of become a problem is if I eat something really quickly and I get it in my stomach and it's gradually going into my small intestine, and then 10 minutes later, I realize I'm late for class or late for an appointment and I start running, I'm going to get cramps. That's my body's way of telling me, look, man, you just inhaled all this food and you got it into the stomach and intestine. We got a lot of blood flow there to help digest it. And now you're asking the body to get a bunch of blood flow into your skeletal muscles. What's it going to be? And so when they say that you should wait 30 minutes after eating before you go swimming, that's the reason why. You're giving your body an opportunity to do some of the digestion. And then after you've done a lot of that, then you can go for your run or do your activity. But of course, it depends on the person, depends on how much you eat. Increased salivating, that is paired with the digestion part of it. It makes sense that you would salivate more in this particular instance, the parasympathetic part, than sweat. Right? I said increased sweating with sympathetic. Sweating is gonna decrease. salivating is going to go up. So conversely, when you activate the sympathetic branch, you're probably going to get decreased salivation as well. Reflexes, we all know them very well. Reflexes are those things that happen automatically without you having to really think about it consciously. So these are rapid, automatic responses to particular stimuli. A single reflex can be studied via the reflex arc, the back and forth of the sensing of that stimulus and the reaction to it. So number one, stimulus arrives. It could be something touching your body, touching your skin. Sensory neuron activation. Remember, those are those afferent neurons going to the central nervous system. Processing of info. Oftentimes, it goes all the way up to the brain, this part of the central nervous system. There are some reflexes that bypass the central nervous system altogether, which is pretty amazing. That's actually located primarily in parts of the digestive tract. So if you're ever, asked a trivia question, name a part of the body where a reflex, in terms of the sensing of it and reaction to it, bypasses the central nervous system altogether. It's actually in the digestive part, in the gut. That's why some people say that the gut is almost like a second brain, because it can kind of regulate all that stuff, reacting to what's going on in itself. But typically, the processing part is those interneurons, the neurons of the central nervous system, helping connect the sensory to the motor. So yes, number 4, motor neuron activation, the sending out of that signal quickly to whatever effector it's going to, whether it's a muscle, a gland, a part of your digestive system, for instance. The response is contraction of a muscle or sweating, what have you. And when we look at the different types of reflexes, these are all opposites of each other. So innate and acquired are opposites. Innate is you're born with it. A reflex that you're born with would be something as simple as tracking an object with your eyes. So even babies at a very young age do this. You hold something in front of their face and their eyes just follow it. It's something that's very natural, and that reflex is around from birth. Acquired reflexes would be something like when you're driving a car and you have a reflex to something that happens, your reflex is to immediately turn the wheel left, or to, you see the red lights in front of you, you slam on the brakes. That's something that doesn't take very long to react to because it is a reflex. So that's acquired. You're not born knowing to slam on the brakes when those red lights happen. Somatic versus visceral. Somatic, once again, means bodily. These are those reflexes that happen naturally, and you don't have to think about it. So somatic reflex is something like that knee test, also called the patellar reflex test. So the doctor, if they're testing your reflexes and they have a little hammer and they're hitting your patellar tendon, it's that tendon that connects the knee to another part of the leg. And when they hit that part, what's happening is they're elongating the tendon with respect to the muscle it's attached to. So when that elongation happens ever so slightly, your body's reaction is for the muscle in your thigh to tense up. And that's supposed to happen very quickly. So they do that test to test your reflexes. A visceral reflex would be something like, if a light is shined into one eye, what's going to tend to happen is your pupil is going to get constricted, because that amount of light, you don't need that much entering your eye. So your body's like, we're gonna lessen the window into which light comes into the eye. The amazing thing is that if you're just shining a light into the right eye, your left pupil should constrict as well at the same time and the same amount. That's a visceral reflex. Monosynaptic versus polysynaptic. The majority of the time, it's polysynaptic. It has to do with how many synapses are involved in the reflex. Mono means one, poly means many. So if there's a lot of processing that needs to happen, it's going to happen quickly. But if there's a lot of steps in terms of numerous synaptic events, it's going to be polysynaptic rather than monosynaptic. And cranial versus spinal means, is it just with the cranial nerves, or is it also with the spinal nerves? Which one is it? Something like that knee jerk is definitely going to be spinal, because the nerves associated with that connect to the spinal cord rather than to the cranium specifically. When we look at a nerve, whether it's a sensory nerve, motor nerve, or mixed, there are some parts you need to keep in mind. And if you remember the structure of a muscle from previous lessons, there's a lot of the same terminology here, same prefixes and one of the same terms. So remember epi, peri, and endo. These prefixes were found in muscle anatomy, but instead of epimysium, it's epineurium. So the epineurium is the outermost superficial connective tissue that's keeping a nerve intact. The fascicles, same term as in muscles. But remember, in muscles, the fascicle contained muscle fibers. In this, the fascicles, sometimes each one's called a fasciculus. I just like saying fascicle. A fasciculus contains a bunch of neurons. It depends on the nerve. I mean, sometimes it's thousands and thousands and thousands. The perineurium is the connective tissue that is separating each fascicle from each other, similar to how it was in a muscle. The neuron is the actual cell that's contained in a fascicle. So we could, pull one of those out. Endoneurium is the connective tissue that is separating individual neurons from each other within one fascicle. So that's the basics of nerve anatomy. You can also see that blood vessels are going to be found there too. That's not color-coded very well in here, but you would see in most diagrams red dots and blue dots because you have little arterioles, little venules taking oxygenated and deoxygenated blood to the parts of the nerve because they're made of cells too, so they need nourishment and they need that waste taken away too. So that's a nerve. Some examples of nerves, I'm not going to go through all of them because there are so many, but one of the classic nerves that you hear about is the vagus nerve. Vagus in this spelling means wanderer, and the reason why they call it the wanderer nerve is because the vagus nerve, when it branches off from the central nervous system, it splits up and goes to a lot of different areas within the torso. So it actually has a lot to do with blood vessels and organs within this part of the body. One of the many functions is sections of the vagus nerve go to the aorta and the carotid artery, and it has to do with the communication of chemoreceptors with the central nervous system. So as your blood it gets more and more CO2 in it, right? If I've inhaled oxygen and then exhaled CO2, if it's been several seconds since I've taken a new breath, right now as I'm talking, I'm not inhaling. I'm actually getting a buildup of CO2 in my bloodstream, which is making it more acidic. And I just breathe in, and then I can exhale again. And the reason why the vagus nerve is important in that sense is the chemoreceptors in the walls of like the carotid artery that sense that increase in acidity. If that didn't happen, your body wouldn't know like, oh, it's time to take another breath because we got to get more O2 and get some CO2 out of the body to reduce that acidity. That's part of the mechanism of just breathing. That's one of the many things the vagus nerve has to do with within the body. The sciatic nerve is another classic nerve a lot of people have heard about. That goes back to the posterior part of the pelvic curvature and down the leg. You can see it goes through the buttocks and down each leg. You may have heard of the term sciatica. That has to do with irritation and swelling with respect to this nerve. So various health conditions can make it so that not only is it hard to move the legs, but you get a numbness, a tingling, pain associated with this nerve getting pressure on it. And surgery is one of the things that can relieve sciatica. Medications can help too. The radial nerve has to do with the radius. So remember, the radius is on the thumb side of the forearm. It's one of the major nerves that's going into your arm. Facial nerves. Facial nerves have to do with moving all the facial muscles. And that actually branches off into numerous little extensions from the nerve to coordinate the different muscle movements of the face. And finally, the two major optic nerves that come from the back of the eye. There's a little bit of a crisscross that happens so that the majority of the information from the right eye goes to the left occipital lobe and vice versa. So those are some classic nerves. Spinal cord medical terms. Two things you may have heard of I want to explain a little bit about. A lumbar puncture or spinal tap is a way of withdrawing some cerebral spinal fluid to do certain tests. That would actually be the way that meningitis is diagnosed. So if you go into the hospital with symptoms of meningitis, they want to test for certain if you have that particular infection going on. So if you stick a needle into one of those cartilaginous pads between the vertebrae, you can actually go just deep enough to withdraw the CSF without going into deeper meningeal layers, because you don't want to get to the spinal cord. If you puncture in the spinal cord, you can cause paralysis. So that's one way that you can withdraw fluid through a spinal tap. The reason why they do it down here is because the space here, the epidural space that's on the more superficial side of this cavity, is greater here. If you go up into the thoracic, cervical parts, it's much more narrow. There's not as much CSF, so it'd be more dangerous to take fluid from those parts. Epidural block. This is done for numerous reasons, but one of the most common ones is if a woman's going through labor and doesn't want to feel the pain of childbirth as much. So an epidural block is the opposite of the spinal tap, because they're actually injecting some anesthesia, some medication is going to reduce the pain. And so wherever they inject that pain medication, you're going to be numbing the nerves that branch off from just that portion. So if you inject it in the lumbar area, you're pretty much covering the area where those labor pains are going to be felt normally. So an epidural block done prior to birth to minimize the pain of childbirth. And once again, they don't want to go too deep with that particular injection because you cause some spinal cord damage. And now for some spinal cord and nerve disorders and conditions. The first one, meningitis, I've mentioned that before, caused by bacteria, fungi, or viruses, has to do with infection and inflammation of that wrapping around the spinal cord and brain. Oftentimes it is fatal if you don't get rid of the bacteria, fungi, or virus that's causing it. Shingles is like chickenpox back with a vengeance. And the reason why I say that is chickenpox is caused by a virus, and it's happening less and less to kids these days because of the chickenpox vaccine. But in people my age and older who've had chickenpox as a kid, sometimes when the chickenpox is done, the virus is not entirely destroyed in your body. Some of the virus goes into a dormant state, also known as the lysogenic cycle, which you may remember from an earlier biology class. So it'll stay in a dormant state for years. And then all of a sudden one day when you're a little bit older, it comes back with a vengeance. Something stimulates it to come back and reattack parts of the skin. And instead of it being the pox, the little, kind of red dots everywhere, it's a rash, and it tends to be concentrated somewhere on the torso. And I've heard it's very painful. It's way worse than chickenpox. That's why I said it's the virus back with a vengeance. So the shingles eventually goes away. The severity can be almost unbearable. Cerebral and nerve palsy has to do with, it's usually factors that the person is born with that are affecting the nerves in the cerebral area or in the nerves that are coming off of the spinal area. And the palsy has to do with a reduction in proper motor control of certain areas. And there's a lot of different palsies. It varies from person to person. Hyposthesia is a fancy way to say it's a reduction in the sensation that someone experiences. So if someone does not have the average sensitivity that you or I would have when their skin is touched, you can call that a hyposthesia. A really severe form of that would be someone who doesn't experience pain. They actually don't get that sensation at all. And when I've described this to people in the past, they've said, "Oh, that would be awesome. I'd love it not to experience pain." No, it wouldn't, because pain is a way that your body is sort of told that something is wrong, right? That something is harming it, that something bad is happening within your body. It's a signal that actually can save your life. So hyposthesia can vary. Sometimes it's just, swelling next to a nerve that's reducing the amount of sensitivity the person experiences. Sometimes it's something the person is born with. Multiple sclerosis affects millions of people. there are probably genetic and environmental factors that have to do with it. It impacts slightly more women than men, but in general, what multiple sclerosis is it's describing the reduction in the myelination that's happening on nerves of the body, and not just the nerves, within the central nervous system as well. So there are areas where you're supposed to have those Schwann cells, you're supposed to have those oligodendrocytes, and they're supposed to be insulating the axon and helping increase the electrical signaling speed. But in a lot of MS cases, you get a reduction in that over time. And there are a lot of signs that happen. It tends to be around the person's 30s and 40s that it tends to be obvious. And in some of those people, it gets worse and worse as time goes on. There are treatments and medications that can delay the effects of MS, and there currently is no cure. Paraplegia and quadriplegia have to do with being paralyzed from somewhere, mid-back down, so it's really impacting the legs. And quadriplegia is some kind of damage to the spinal cord that impacts all of the limbs. So someone who's in a wheelchair who's able to use their arms, they've had probably some kind of accident, and it varies, that has impacted some part of their lumbar spine or thoracic spine. And that injury cut off the ability of the brain and spinal cord to signal past that point of injury, and to get signals coming up past the point of injury. So generally, it's going to impact the motor and sensory tracts of that spinal cord section and everything past it. Quadriplegia means if you have a neck break in the cranial part of the spinal cord that's bad enough, it can permanently damage part of the cervical spinal cord, and that's taking those signals not only to the arms, but all the way down the spinal cord. So those also currently have no cure, but there is hope that there will be a cure for these types of paralysis. Thank you for watching Educator.com.